Chapter 3. In the year 1835, chance avenged Pons for the indifference of womankind by finding him a prop for his declining years, as the saying goes, and he, who had been old from his cradle, found a support in friendship. Pons took to himself the only life-partner permitted to him among his kind, an old man and a fellow musician. But for La Fontaine's fable, Les Deux Amis, this sketch should have borne the title of The Two Friends, but to take the name of this divine story would surely be a deed of violence, a profanation from which every true man of letters would shrink. The title ought to be borne alone and forever by the fabulist's masterpiece, the revelation of his soul and the record of his dreams. Those three words were set once and forever by the poet at the head of a page which is his by a sacred right of ownership. For it is a shrine before which all generations, all over the world, will kneel so long as the art of printing shall endure. Pons's friend gave lessons on the pianoforte. They met and struck up an acquaintance in 1834, one prize day at a boarding school, and so congenial were their ways of thinking and living that Pons used to say that he had found his friend too late for his happiness. Never, perhaps, did two souls so much alike find each other in the great ocean of humanity which flowed forth in disobedience to the will of God from its source in the Garden of Eden. Before very long the two musicians could not live without each other. Confidences were exchanged, and in a week's time they were like brothers. Schmucke, for that was his name, had not believed that such a man as Pons existed, nor had Pons imagined that a Schmucke was possible. Here already you have a sufficient description of the good couple. But it is not every mind that takes kindly to the concise synthetic method, and a certain amount of demonstration is necessary if the credulous are to accept the conclusion. This pianist, like all other pianists, was a German. A German like the eminent Liszt and the great Mendelssohn and Steibelt and Dussek and Meyer and Mozart and Dürer and Thalberg and Dreschok and Hiller and Leopold Herz, Wurz, Carr, Wolf, Pixis and Clara Wieck, and all Germans, generally speaking. Schmucke was a great musical composer, doomed to remain a music master, so utterly did his character lack the audacity which a musical genius needs if he is to push his way to the front. A German's naivety does not invariably last him through his life. In some cases it fails after a certain age, and even as a cultivator of the soil brings water from afar by means of irrigation channels, so, from the springs of his youth, does the Teuton draw the simplicity which disarms suspicion, the perennial supplies with which he fertilizes his labors in every field of science, art, or commerce. A crafty Frenchman here and there will turn a Parisian tradesman's stupidity to good account in the same way. But Schmucke had kept his child's simplicity, much as Pons continued to wear his relics of the empire, all unsuspectingly. The true and noble-hearted German was at once the theatre and the audience, making music within himself, for himself alone. In this city of Paris he lived as a nightingale lives among the thickets, and for 20 years he sang on, mateless, till he met with a second self in Pons. Both Pons and Schmucke were abundantly given, both by heart and disposition, to the peculiarly German sentimentality which shows itself alike in childlike ways, in a passion for flowers, in that form of nature worship which prompts a German to plant his garden beds with big glass globes for the sake of seeing miniature pictures of the view which he can behold about him of a natural size, in the inquiring turn of mind that sets a learned Teuton trudging 300 miles in his gaiters in search of a fact which smiles up in his face from a wayside spring, or lurks laughing under the jessamine leaves in the backyard. Or, to take a final instance, in the German craving to endow every least detail in creation with a spiritual significance, a craving which produces sometimes Hoffmann's tipsiness in type, sometimes the folios with which Germany hedges the simplest questions round about, lest haply any fool should fall into her intellectual excavations. And indeed, if you fathom these abysses, you find nothing but a German at the bottom. Both friends were Catholics. They went to Mass and performed the duties of religion together, and, like children, found nothing to tell their confessors. It was their firm belief that music is to feeling and thought as thought and feeling are to speech, and of their converse on this system there was no end. Each made response to the other in orgies of sound, demonstrating their convictions, each for each, like lovers. Schmucke was as absent-minded as Pons was wide awake. Pons was a collector, Schmucke a dreamer of dreams. Schmucke was a student of beauty seen by the soul, Pons a preserver of material beauty. Pons would catch sight of a china cup and buy it in the time that Schmucke took to blow his nose, wondering the while within himself whether the musical phrase that was ringing in his brain, the motif from Rossini or Bellini or Beethoven or Mozart, had its origin or its counterpart in the world of human thought and emotion. Schmucke's economies were controlled by an absent mind. Pons was a spendthrift through passion, and for both the result was the same. They had not a penny on St. Sylvester's Day. Perhaps Pons would have given way under his troubles if it had not been for this friendship. But life became bearable when he found someone to whom he could pour out his heart. The first time that he breathed a word of his difficulties, the good German had advised him to live as he himself did, and eat bread and cheese at home, sooner than dine abroad at such a cost. Alas, Pons did not dare to confess that heart and stomach were at war within him, that he could digest affronts which pained his heart, and, cost what it might, a good dinner that satisfied his palate was a necessity to him, even as your gay Lothario must have a mistress to tease. In time Schmucke understood, not just at once, for he was too much of a Teuton to possess that gift of swift perception in which the French rejoice. Schmucke understood and loved poor Pons the better. Nothing so fortifies a friendship as a belief on the part of one friend that he is superior to the other. An angel could not have found a word to say to Schmucke, rubbing his hands over the discovery of the hold that gluttony had gained over Pons. Indeed, the good German adorned their breakfast table next morning with delicacies of which he went in search himself, and every day he was careful to provide something new for his friend, for they always breakfasted together at home. If anyone imagines that the pair could not escape ridicule in Paris, where nothing is respected, he cannot know that city. When Schmucke and Pons united their riches and poverty, they hit upon the economical expedient of lodging together, each paying half the rent of the very unequally divided second floor of a house in the Rue de Normandie in the Marais. And as it often happened that they left home together and walked side by side along their beat of boulevard, the idlers of the quarter dubbed them the pair of nutcrackers, a nickname which makes any portrait of Schmucke quite superfluous, for he was to Pons as the famous statue of the Nurse of Niobe in the Vatican is to the Tribune Venus. Madame Cibot, portress of the house in the Rue de Normandie, was the pivot on which the domestic life of the nutcrackers turned. But Madame Cibot plays so large a part in the drama which grew out of their double existence that it will be more appropriate to give her portrait on her first appearance in this scene of Parisian life. One thing remains to be said of the characters of the pair of friends, but this one thing is precisely the hardest to make clear to 99 readers out of 100 in this 47th year of the 19th century. perhaps by reason of the prodigious financial development brought about by the railway system. It is a little thing, and yet it is so much. It is a question, in fact, of giving an idea of the extreme sensitiveness of their natures. Let us borrow an illustration from the railways, if only by way of retaliation, as it were, for the loans which they levy upon us. The railway train of today, tearing over the metals, grinds away fine particles of dust, grains so minute that a traveller cannot detect them with the eye. But let a single one of those invisible motes find its way into the kidneys, it will bring about that most excruciating and sometimes fatal disease known as gravel. And our society, rushing like a locomotive along its metalled track, is heedless of the all but imperceptible dust made by the grinding of the wheels. But it was otherwise with the two musicians. The invisible grains of sand sank perpetually into the very fibres of their being, causing them intolerable anguish of heart. Tender exceedingly to the pain of others, they wept for their own powerlessness to help, and their own susceptibilities were almost morbidly acute. Neither age nor the continual spectacle of the drama of Paris life had hardened two souls still young and childlike and pure. The longer they lived, indeed, the more keenly they felt their inward suffering. For so it is, alas, with natures unsullied by the world, with the quiet thinker, and with such poets among the poets as have never fallen into any excess. Since the old men began housekeeping together, the day's routine was very nearly the same for them both. They worked together in harness in the fraternal fashion of the Paris cab-horse, rising every morning, summer and winter, at 7 o'clock, and setting out after breakfast to give music lessons in the boarding schools, in which, upon occasion, they would take lessons for each other. Towards noon, Pons repaired to his theatre, if there was a rehearsal on hand, but all his spare moments were spent in sauntering on the boulevards. Night found both of them in the orchestra at the theatre, for Pons had found a place for Schmucke, and upon this wise. At the time of their first meeting, Pons had just received that marshal's baton of the unknown musical composer, an appointment as conductor of an orchestra. It had come to him unasked, by a favour of Count Popinot, a bourgeois hero of July, at that time a member of the government. Count Popinot had the license of a theatre in his gift, and Count Popinot had also an old acquaintance of the kind that the successful man blushes to meet. As he rolls through the streets of Paris in his carriage, it is not pleasant to see his boyhood's chum down at heel, with a coat of many improbable colours and trousers innocent of straps, and a head full of soaring speculations on too grand a scale to tempt shy, easily scared capital. Moreover, this friend of his youth, Gaudissart by name, had done not a little in the past towards founding the fortunes of the great house of Popinot. Popinot, now a count and a peer of France, after twice holding a portfolio, had no wish to shake off the illustrious Gaudissart. Quite otherwise. The pomps and vanities of the court of the citizen king had not spoiled the sometime druggist's kind heart. He wished to put his ex-commercial traveller in the way of renewing his wardrobe and replenishing his purse. So when Gaudissart, always an enthusiastic admirer of the fair sex, applied for the license of a bankrupt theatre, Popinot granted it on condition that Pons, a parasite of the Hôtel Popinot, should be engaged as conductor of the orchestra. And at the same time the Count was careful to send certain elderly amateurs of beauty to the theatre, so that the new manager might be strongly supported financially by wealthy admirers of feminine charms, revealed by the costume of the ballet. Gaudissart and company, who, be it said, made their fortune, hit upon the grand idea of operas for the people, and carried it out in a boulevard theatre in 1834. A tolerable conductor, who could adapt or even compose a little music upon occasion, was a necessity for ballets and pantomimes. But the last management had so long been bankrupt that they could not afford to keep a transposer and copyist. Pons therefore introduced Schmucke to the company as copier of music, a humble calling which requires no small musical knowledge, and Schmucke, acting on Pons's advice, came to an understanding with the chef de service at the Opera Comique, so saving himself the clerical drudgery. The partnership between Pons and Schmucke produced one brilliant result. Schmucke being a German, harmony was his strong point. He looked over the instrumentation of Pons's compositions, and Pons provided the airs. Here and there an amateur among the audience admired the new pieces of music which served as accompaniment to 2 or 3 great successes, but they attributed the improvement vaguely to progress. No one cared to know the composer's name. Like occupants of the baignoire, lost to view of the house, to gain a view of the stage, Pons and Schmucke eclipsed themselves by their success. In Paris, especially since the Revolution of July, no one can hope to succeed unless he will push his way quibus cumque viis, and with all his might through a formidable host of competitors. But for this feat a man needs thews and sinews, and our 2 friends, be it remembered, had that affection of the heart which cripples all ambitious effort. Pons, as a rule, only went to his theatre towards 8 o'clock, when the piece in favor came on, and overtures and accompaniments needed the strict ruling of the baton. Most minor theatres are lax in such matters, and Pons felt the more at ease because he himself had been by no means grasping in all his dealings with the management. And Schmucke, if need be, could take his place. Time went by, and Schmucke became an institution in the orchestra. The illustrious Gaudissart said nothing, but he was well aware of the value of Pons's collaborator. He was obliged to include a pianoforte in the orchestra, following the example of the leading theatres. The instrument was placed beside the conductor's chair, and Schmucke played without increase of salary, a volunteer supernumerary. As Schmucke's character, his utter lack of ambition or pretense, became known, the orchestra recognized him as one of themselves, and as time went on, he was entrusted with the often needed miscellaneous musical instruments which form no part of the regular band of a boulevard theatre. For a very small addition to his stipend, Schmucke played the viola d'amore, hautboy, violoncello, and harp, as well as the piano, the castanets for the cachucha, the bells, saxhorn, and the like. If the Germans cannot draw harmony from the mighty instruments of liberty, yet to play all instruments of music comes to them by nature. The 2 old artists were exceedingly popular at the theatre, and took its ways philosophically. They had put, as it were, scales over their eyes, lest they should see the offences that needs must come when a corps de ballet is blended with actors and actresses, one of the most trying combinations ever created by the laws of supply and demand for the torment of managers, authors, and composers alike. Every one esteemed Pons with his kindness and his modesty, his great self-respect and respect for others, for a pure and limpid life wins something like admiration from the worst nature in every social sphere, and in Paris a fair virtue meets with something of the success of a large diamond, so great a rarity it is. No actor, no dancer, however brazen, would have indulged in the mildest practical joke at the expense of either Pons or Schmucke. Pons very occasionally put in an appearance in the foyer, but all that Schmucke knew of the theatre was the underground passage from the street door to the orchestra. Sometimes, however, during an interval, the good German would venture to make a survey of the house, and ask a few questions of the first flute, a young fellow from Strasbourg, who came of a German family at Kehl. Gradually, under the flute's tuition, Schmucke's childlike imagination acquired a certain amount of knowledge of the world. He could believe in the existence of that fabulous creature, the lorette, the possibility of marriages at the 13th arrondissement, the vagaries of the leading lady, and the contraband traffic carried on by box-openers. In his eyes, the more harmless forms of vice were the lowest depths of Babylonish iniquity. He did not believe the stories, he smiled at them for grotesque inventions. The ingenious reader can see that Pons and Schmucke were exploited, to use a word much in fashion, but what they lost in money they gained in consideration and kindly treatment. It was after the success of the ballet with which a run of success began for the Gaudissart Company that the management presented Pons with a piece of plate, a group of figures attributed to Benvenuto Cellini. The alarming costliness of the gift caused talk in the green room. It was a matter of 1,200 francs. Pons, poor honest soul, was for returning the present, and Gaudissart had a world of trouble to persuade him to keep it. "Ah," said the manager afterwards when he told his partner of the interview, "if we could only find actors up to that sample." In their joint life, outwardly so quiet, there was the one disturbing element, the weakness to which Pons sacrificed, the insatiable craving to dine out. Whenever Schmucke happened to be at home while Pons was dressing for the evening, the good German would bewail this deplorable habit. "Gif only he was any fatter for it," he many a time cried. And Schmucke would dream of curing his friend of his degrading vice, for a true friend's instinct, in all that belongs to the inner life, is unerring as a dog's sense of smell. A friend knows by intuition the trouble in his friend's soul, and guesses at the cause, and ponders it in his heart. Pons, who always wore a diamond ring on the little finger of his right hand, an ornament permitted in the time of the Empire, but ridiculous today, Pons, who belonged to the troubadour time, the sentimental periods of the First Empire, was too much a child of his age, too much of a Frenchman, to wear the expression of divine serenity which softened Schmucke's hideous ugliness. From Pons's melancholy looks, Schmucke knew that the profession of parasite was growing daily more difficult and painful. And in fact, in that month of October 1844, the number of houses at which Pons dined was naturally much restricted. Reduced to move round and round the family circle, he had used the word family in far too wide a sense, as will shortly be seen. Monsieur Camusot, the rich silk mercer of the Rue des Bourdonnais, had married Pons's first cousin, Mademoiselle Pons, only child and heiress of one of the well-known firm of Pons Brothers, court embroiderers. Pons's own father and mother retired from a firm founded before the Revolution of 1789, leaving their capital in the business until Mademoiselle Pons's father sold it in 1815 to Monsieur Rivet. Monsieur Camusot had since lost his wife and married again, and retired from business some 10 years, and now, in 1844, he was a member of the Board of Trade, a deputy and what not. But the Camusot clan were friendly, and Pons, good man, still considered that he was some kind of cousin to the children of the second marriage, who were not relations or even connected with him in any way. The second Madame Camusot being a Mademoiselle Cardot, Pons introduced himself as a relative into the tolerably numerous Cardot family, a second bourgeois tribe which, taken with its connections, formed quite as strong a clan as the Camusots. For Cardot the notary, brother of the second Madame Camusot, had married a Mademoiselle Chiffreville, and the well-known family of Chiffreville, the leading firm of manufacturing chemists, was closely connected with the whole drug trade, of which Monsieur Anselme Popinot was for many years the undisputed head, until the Revolution of July plunged him into the very centre of the dynastic movement, as everybody knows. So Pons, in the wake of the Camusots and Cardots, reached the Chiffrevilles, and thence the Popinots, always in the character of a cousin's cousin. The above concise statement of Pons's relations with his entertainers explains how it came to pass that an old musician was received in 1844 as one of the family in the houses of 4 distinguished persons, to wit, Monsieur le Comte Popinot, peer of France and twice in office, Monsieur Cardot, retired notary, mayor, and deputy of an arrondissement in Paris, Monsieur Camusot, senior, a member of the Board of Trade and the Municipal Chamber and a peerage, and lastly, Monsieur Camusot de Marville, Camusot's son by his first marriage, and Pons's one genuine relation, albeit even he was a first cousin once removed. This Camusot, president of a chamber of the Court of Appeal in Paris, had taken the name of his estate at Marville to distinguish himself from his father and a younger half-brother. Cardot, the retired notary, had married his daughter to his successor, whose name was Berthier, and Pons, transferred as part of the connection, acquired a right to dine with the Berthiers, in the presence of a notary, as he put it. This was the bourgeois empyrean which Pons called his family, that upper world in which he so painfully reserved his right to a knife and fork. Of all these houses, some 10 in all, the one in which Pons ought to have met with the kindest reception should by rights have been his own cousin's, and indeed he paid most attention to President Camusot's family. But alas, Madame Camusot de Marville, daughter of the Sieur Thirion, usher of the cabinet to Louis XVIII and Charles X, had never taken very kindly to her husband's first cousin once removed. Pons had tried to soften this formidable relative. He wasted his time, for in spite of the pianoforte lessons which he gave gratuitously to Mademoiselle Camusot, a young woman with hair somewhat inclined to red, it was impossible to make a musician of her. And now, at this very moment, as he walked with that precious object in his hand, Pons was bound for the president's house, where he always felt as if he were at the Tuileries itself, so heavily did the solemn green curtains, the carmelite brown hangings, thick piled carpets, heavy furniture, and general atmosphere of magisterial severity oppress his soul. Strange as it may seem, he felt more at home in the Hôtel Popinot, Rue Basse du Rempart, probably because it was full of works of art. For the master of the house, since he entered public life, had acquired a mania for collecting beautiful things. By way of contrast, no doubt, for a politician is obliged to pay for secret services of the ugliest kind.